Is it your view, having lived, grown up, and devoted yourself to understanding the political economy of Puerto Rico, is Puerto Rico a colony of the United States? And if you think so, what is the evidence you use to get you to that conclusion?
Yes, I believe Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. To begin with, the U.S. Congress has what has been termed by politicians, historians, and lawyers as plenary powers over Puerto Rico, meaning that Congress has complete control over Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans cannot vote in federal elections, and economic conditions are considerably worse in the colony than they are in the metropolis. The poverty rate, for example, in Puerto Rico is 44%, which is twice as high as Mississippi, the poorest U.S. state. And the Gini index measuring economic inequality is 0.55, which is higher than any U.S. state. That is to say, the colony is both poorer and more unequal than any U.S. state. But to further examine whether Puerto Rico is a colony of the U.S. empire, let me first begin by defining imperialism, which, according to Michael Parenti, is, quote, the process whereby the dominant politico-economic interests of one nation expropriate for their own enrichment the land, labor, raw materials, and markets of another people, end quote. This is exactly the process that has been unfolding in Puerto Rico since the U.S. invasion of 1898. As Nelson Dennis wrote in his book, War Against All Puerto Ricans, Puerto Rico passed into the hands of the U.S. in 1898 as, quote, the spoils of victory in the Spanish-American War, end quote. He further states that, quote, the following year, the United States outlawed all Puerto Rican currency and declared the island's peso, with a global value equal to the US dollar, to be worth only 60 American cents. Every Puerto Rican lost 40% of their savings overnight, end quote. So the combined effects of a devalued currency, a colonial land tax, and hurricanes destroying crops was that the incipient bourgeoisie was rendered unable to meet its obligations, and the U.S. banks foreclosed on them. The banks then proceeded to turn the diversified Puerto Rican agriculture into one giant sugarcane plantation, which was more profitable to them at the time. Thus, Puerto Rico lost its ability to feed itself, to in turn feed the pockets of absentee landlords. As Dennis recounts, by 1934, every sugarcane farm in Puerto Rico belonged to one of 41 syndicates, 80% of which were US owned. And so the people of Puerto Rico have had their land, labor, raw materials, and markets expropriated by the US capitalist class. The Puerto Rican independence movement has endured a brutal history of repression. Pro-independence activists have been systematically persecuted, arrested, tortured, and even murdered. These repressive measures have delivered a huge blow to the Puerto Rican independence movement, which is in turn the reason why Puerto Rico is ruled today by two major pro-US parties. So we don't have an independent movement. We are owned by an independent government, We are owned by Congress, and we don't have voting representation in Congress. Our president is the US president, and yet we cannot vote in presidential elections. So to me, all of this is evidence that we are indeed a colony of the United States of America.